Hi, this is Gemma. This is my first video diary entry for my Pulse Social internship. So this was my first week. I started on Tuesday the 19th of October. The first thing we did on Tuesday morning, we had a morning meeting at 8 AM, which will happen every single week. That's where you get your briefing for the week, and that's also where you just get a bit of social time with other people, just because it's a remote position, so it's really nice to just connect with other people within the organisation. So that was really nice. We spent sort of half an hour having a chat. I got to talk to the other interns about any pressing questions and get some perspectives on, other things within the organisation, really. So that was really cool. And then Tuesday afternoon, I learned a little bit more about my briefing for the week, and I was devising some questions for my podcast, which I was recording the next day. So I sent those across to the lady that I was going to be interviewing for her approval. She came back, was really happy with the questions, so that was really good. And then on Wednesday was when we recorded the podcast episode. I really, really enjoyed doing the podcast episode. We had such a good chat. She was so lovely. And I think we could have talked for much longer than we had available to us. So that was really good. And then Thursday morning, I edited the podcast episode. Thursday afternoon was when I did the news bulletin. So I talked about the upcoming podcast and blog episodes, and, did a little bit of research around some upcoming sports issues as well. So yeah, that was what I did Thursday, and then I edited that. And then Friday I wrote my second blog segment. So I tried to vary it a little bit. So it was all on disability sports, but the podcast episode had quite a heavy focus on social isolation within the disabled community and disability sports, and how we can involve more people from the disabled community within sports. The blog post was really focused on the influence of the Paralympics on investment within disability sports. So it was just to vary the content a little bit. I found the topic of disability sports really interesting, because I think it's an area that over this past sort of 5 to 10 years has experienced a lot of growth. So it was really interesting to do a lot of research on it. So next week we're moving on to community sports. So I can't wait to see where that takes me next. Hi everyone, Gemma here, and this is my second video diary entry for my journalism internship at Pulse Social. So as mentioned last time, this week we were focused on community sports. That topic is actually split across 2 weeks, so this week that's just gone and next week as well. We've had to adapt our way of working slightly this time round. Because the topic is split across 2 weeks, we're going to do 2 podcast episodes on community sports. However, both our interviewees were only available next week. So what that's meant is that this week I've done 2 blog segments and no podcast, and then next week I will do 2 podcast episodes and no blogs. It's been a different way of working, but I found that the benefit of working this way is that I've had a little bit more time to dedicate to research, and then decide what issues within community sports that I really want to hone in on. So that's been actually really enjoyable. So for example, I kind of knew this time round that I wanted to talk about something to do with the Midlands. I'm from the Midlands, and one of my blog segments is on the fact that community sports in the Midlands often receive much less funding than, for example, London-based community sports. There's a myriad of reasons for that, but one of the issues in particular is lack of rural access to public transport, which means that a lot of people from villages can't attend city-based community clubs unless they want to drive quite a significant distance, and not everybody can do that. So that was the benefit of working this way round, was, I had that opportunity to decide, okay, actually this topic is really interesting to me. Let's sit down and do, and read what we can about it. So that was really cool. Then the second blog is on sport uptake levels are down across the country, and why investing in community sports could be of benefit not just to the individual, but the community generally. So for example, there's lots of interesting research being done around the link between sport and academic achievement, which is really interesting. So that's kind of been this week. It's been different, but I have found that I've had more time for research, which is really good, and that's what I really love to do. You know, I love reading and learning, and I've kind of found it quite an enriching experience, which is really cool. So next week it's 2 podcast episodes. We've got some really cool interviewees. One of them has experience coaching abroad, which will be really interesting. He's worked with representatives from the soccer club LA Galaxy, so that's really cool. The second guy is from the London Football Association, and we'll be talking about community-based projects within the London area. So both of them have lots of experience on running community projects. So yeah, I'm really excited to do those podcast episodes next week. Hi everyone, it's Gemma. This is my 3rd week doing a video diary for Pulse Social. So this week again, we were on community sports. As I mentioned, it's been a bit of a different way of working this time round because we did both of our podcast episodes this week. So this week I spoke to 2 really amazing guys. The first one was called Aquila Burgess. He's football development manager with the London FA. So that was really all about community projects within the London area, particularly focusing on female sports and working with disadvantaged communities. So that was really interesting and insightful. I had a really good chat with Aquila. And then the second one was a guy called Ernest Aco. He works for an organisation called Sportworks. Sportworks is actually a much bigger concern. It has bases from London, the southeast, all the way up to the northeast. So really, really big area. And again, we were talking about community projects, but it had more of a focus on regional and cultural differences, which mean that there are varying levels of sport uptake across the country. Ernest has actually worked in America. He's actually worked with LA Galaxy, which is really cool. So we brought in elements of that as well. So I would say the main thing that I've learnt from this week is about doing your research on the person you're talking to. Because without doing that research, I would never have known that, for example, Ernest had worked in America. So that's the big takeaway I've had from this week. Really look into the organisation, look into the person in particular that you're speaking to, not just their bio, but their work history. Because I think it allows you then to draw upon their experiences, which makes for a much richer discussion. So it's been really, really fun this week. So yeah, and then next week we will be starting a topic on eating disorders. I'm actually speaking to Jenny Tomei, who works for Pulse Social. So that will be a really nice and interesting crossover. So yeah, I'm really excited for that. Hi everyone, it's Gemma here, and this is my 4th video diary for my Pulse Social internship. So this week we started a new topic. It was eating disorders. It's a really different topic for me. It's not something that I have a huge amount of experience in. So first and foremost, my approach was to really do a lot of research around it, mainly because it's a sensitive topic and I really wanted to handle it with respect, and make sure that what I was saying, A, wasn't going to trigger anyone or hurt anyone's feelings, and secondly, to make sure that the information that I was putting out there was accurate, because again, misinformation in the media, never a good thing. So that was my first approach, was to really do some background research, and through the course of the background research, I came across a few eating disorder charities, one of them being Beat, and I actually approached them. So that, they've been kind enough to sit down with me, and we're going to do a podcast episode for next week's work, which is really, really cool. So I'm really looking forward to that. This week I spoke to Jenny Tomei, who is Director of Operations here at Pulse Social. Now she's qualified in many areas of nutrition and personal training, and she also previously suffered from an eating disorder herself, so it was really interesting to sit down with her and talk about her experiences and her advice. So that's kind of been this week. really, it's been interesting, but it's unlike something like community sports. In a similar way to when I did disability sports, it's really about getting your information correct, and making sure that you're handling the topic with a great deal of sensitivity, because it's an incredibly pertinent and worthwhile topic to discuss. It's just making sure that you approach it in the right way. So you know, it's been an eye-opener for me, and really good, actually really enriching. So I've got a second week of that next week, and like I say, I'll be sitting down with Beat. So that will be really good and really informative, and I really hope that we've made some great and informative content out of it as well. Hi everyone, it's Gemma here, and this is my 5th video diary for my Pulse Social internship. So this week was my second week on eating disorders. As I mentioned last week, it's been a real departure for me, this topic, because it's much more serious and needs to be handled with real sensitivity. Having said that, I felt like this week I was really in my flow. I think because last week I did a lot of upfront work on the research end, so I kind of already knew what topics within eating disorders that I wanted to cover, so that was really helpful. This week for the podcast, I spoke to a lovely lady called Kerry. She's from the eating disorder charity Beat. It made for a really fun and informative discussion. It was mainly on eating disorders within athletics, and what we can do, particularly what sports organisations can do to prevent that. So it was a really, really good discussion. What I really enjoyed was she came loaded with facts and stats, which when you're interviewing somebody is really fantastic, because it means that you've got much more to discuss. You know, I was listening to her, and then that helped me formulate things to bounce off of her with. So it made for a really rich discussion as well. So that was absolutely fantastic. And what I will say is it was a real confidence boost when Beat agreed to meet with me, because approaching them, I was like, they're a huge charity. They won't want to talk to somebody who is you know, relatively inexperienced. But when I talked to them, they said, you know, we're so passionate about getting the message out there that we want to talk to anybody who will listen and just help spread the message. So, you know, that was brilliant. And I think that just goes to show, if you want to reach out to somebody, you should do it, because the answer may well surprise you. So this week has been, you know, brilliant in terms of the work that I've done, but also, you know, what I've learnt as well about just going out there and striving for it, really. So next week is my last week at Pulse. I have had an absolutely fantastic time. I will do a more thorough breakdown next week of what I've learned and what I've enjoyed. But what I will say is I'm really, really loving the whole process. My final topic will be female sports, so that should be a really interesting one too. So I can't wait for the week ahead. Hi everyone, it's Gemma here, and this is my 6th and final video diary for my Journalism Pulse Social internship. So firstly, I'm just going to talk about what happened on my final week, and then I'll do a segment at the end just summing up my overall experience. So first and foremost, this week I was focusing on female sports. I spoke on my podcast to a lovely lady called Clara Toombs. She's a women in leadership coach. This presented a slight challenge for me that I hadn't massively experienced before, in that she's, in her work, she isn't sports based. She's a keen netball player. She plays netball in her free time. However, her work is really about pushing women to achieve in their career and in business. So that led me to have to adapt the questions, because obviously the focus was women in sports. Pulse Social is obviously a sports oriented organisation. So what I had to do was try and link every question back to sport. So it was things like, how has sport helped you in your career? You know, what key skills have you learnt? Does having a healthy lifestyle outside of work help your career? That kind of thing. So what that meant was we had a really rich discussion, both about how women can advance in the workplace, but also why having good hobbies, healthy hobbies, sports outside of work is a benefit to women in the workplace. So we were kind of covered on both fronts, and it made for a really lively discussion. And Clara was brilliant. She gave some really good advice, had some really inspirational stories about how she's worked her way up in her career. So that was really good. And then for my blog, I wrote about the gender pay gap in sports. So that was all about how women's sports are very often under promoted, and how this leads to inequalities in things like attendance sales and merchandising sales as well, between male and female sports. So that was a really interesting topic. So that kind of allowed me to give a really well-rounded response to the brief. So I had a really good final week. I really enjoyed it. So moving on now to my overall experience. First and foremost, I've loved every second of it. The team at Pulse have been really fantastic, really supportive. They had a really well-balanced approach to my internship, where they at the start gave me a fair amount of support in that first week in setting me up with everything that I would need. But as the weeks progressed, it got less and less involved on their parts, because I was pretty settled in my role and what I was doing. Every week we had a team meeting where I would get feedback, which was brilliant. So I felt really well supported, and Marlon, who was my manager, was always at the end of the phone, always available on WhatsApp. I can't fault them. They've been absolutely brilliant. What I've enjoyed the most about my internship has to be the podcasts. They've been fantastic to do. Being able to connect with people, that's what I really enjoy, especially as I have obviously acting experience. So it's just really reaffirmed that love for me of communication and presenting as well. So that's been really fantastic. I've really enjoyed the challenge of having a new person every week that you have to research their background and then come up with questions based on that. What I tried to do was bring questions that were, I suppose, outside the box, in terms of it wasn't sort of tell us about yourself, what's your role. I kind of gave a brief introduction of their role at the start of every podcast, so that we could get straight into more of the minutiae of A, their role, but B, them as a person, because I felt that was far more engaging to the participant, but also I think to a listener that would be far more interesting, because it's not the standard interview questions that you might expect. So I've really enjoyed doing. Obviously, I loved the blogs, the news bulletins, and everything else. But I have to say the podcasts have been a real highlight for me, because I think you've got the freedom to really explore the issues that you want, and that's another thing that's been brilliant at Pulse is the freedom that they give you to really explore. They obviously give you a remit, for example, female sports, but within that you can explore anything you want, which has been brilliant. So my biggest takeaway from the experience has to be perseverance. Obviously, I've learned lots of things throughout the internship: time management, research skills, networking, all of that great stuff. But I think perseverance has to be the biggest lesson. So I had to find a couple of my own interview participants, and you get far more no's than yeses. And that's been a huge learning curve for me in really persevering and saying, right, on to the next, and not feeling knocked back by a no. Which is why when I mentioned in week 5 how grateful I was that Beat agreed to talk to me, because I'd had a few no's before that, and when such a huge organisation such as Beat agrees to talk to you, that's amazing. But I kind of had an idea that Beat might, because I'd done the research on them and knew that they were really accepting of new talent. They were really passionate about spreading the message. So I kind of thought, if anyone's going to talk to me, it's going to be Beat. So that was the biggest takeaway that I had from that, is perseverance, and also doing your research into who's out there, and based on that, who's the most likely to talk to you. So what I'm doing now, I'm very lucky to have been invited on board a research project. I'm a research assistant. We're looking into diversity within higher education. So I've just started that, and I think that's going to be really interesting, particularly as someone who's just finished doing a master's degree. I think that's going to be really interesting. However, the funding on that only runs until February, so I'm still looking for a full-time job beyond that. Obviously, like I mentioned, I pick up acting work fairly regularly, but beyond that, this has definitely shown me that journalism is what I love. Presenting, I love. So anything in journalism and PR, I'm definitely going to be going for in the future. Just once again, before I sign off, thank you to the team at Pulse. I've had a wonderful time, and thank you to all that have followed my journey with me. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.